39-year-old Star Boomer was making strides towards a better future. Mother to a young son and in the midst of a divorce, she was studying hard to obtain her GED so she could start her own business. Sadly, just days before she was set to take the test, she would vanish, though perhaps not so mysteriously. On a cool Tuesday afternoon in February of 1999, Star walked into a local dive bar. Slowly sipping her drink, she wasn't planning to stay long, but when she never made it home, friends and family were worried. This was unlike her to be out of touch, and they knew almost immediately that something had to be wrong. Detectives began where Star had last been seen, Uncle Mike's bar in the Turner section of Kansas City. Quickly, they would come to discover that Star hadn't merely disappeared. She'd been the victim of a violent crime. More than a dozen witnesses saw what happened and who had been responsible, yet they kept their silence, either too afraid to speak up or too ambivalent to care. Was Star's disappearance random, the result of a violent bar encounter? Was a man who later murdered his own wife responsible? Or had 13 bar patrons cowardly chosen to protect two violent felons with a history of disturbing crimes, instead of standing up for Star when she needed them the most? This is Trace Evidence Episode 183, The Disappearance of Star Boomer. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the disturbing disappearance of Star Boomer. Before getting into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. You can follow the show on social media on Twitter @TraceEvPod, Instagram @TraceEvidencePod, or by searching Facebook for Trace Evidence. If you're interested in supporting the show and getting some Trace Evidence merch, there's a Patreon at patreon.com/traceevidence, or you can donate directly via PayPal. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or email me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. 39-year-old Star Boomer had come to a crossroads and decided to launch the next chapter of her life. With dreams of a future spent watching her son grow up and building her own business, she was upbeat and looking forward to the challenge. Then, after stopping in at a local bar, she never made it home. This is episode 183, The Disappearance of Star Boomer. Away from the bright lights and busy streets of downtown Kansas City stands a small, aging building with chipped flakes of blue paint and deep cracks in the walls. It's hardly an attraction for those out looking for a good time on Friday night, but to locals seeking the comfort, familiarity, and dive bar atmosphere, it's always been a popular spot. 39-year-old Star Boomer knew the bar, known then as Uncle Mike's. She grew up in the neighborhood, was friends with or acquaintances to many of the people who lived in the homes that dotted up and down the avenues nearby. Then one Tuesday afternoon in February of 1999, she stopped in for a drink, never realizing she'd never walk out. As she sat on a stool leaning her elbows against the old L-shaped bar, she watched as an argument between a man and a woman began to turn violent. Not one to look away, she leapt from her seat and got between the two, hoping to protect the woman and convince the man to back off. Star didn't like to see anyone treated poorly, let alone a smaller woman being verbally abused by a large and dangerous man, with a bad reputation and the propensity for violence to back it up. She put herself at risk to help someone else, but when the violence turned towards her, more than a dozen witnesses looked on in silence. No one tried to protect her, no one spoke up for her, and when she disappeared, no one tried to help find her. They simply turned their heads, sipped their drinks, and continued their conversations. It wasn't their business. They certainly weren't going to get involved. And more than 2 decades later, they continue to conceal the truth of what they saw that day, and more importantly, who they saw. Star Boomer never made it home. She never saw her family or her beloved son again, and while their silence allowed killers to continue walking the streets for the past 2 decades, it has also kept Starr's fate hidden from her loved ones, with closure just out of reach. Investigators called to locate the missing mother would have to face a wall of silence, an uncooperative bar owner, and 2 violent murder suspects who knew, as long as everyone kept their mouths shut, they'd never have to answer for what they had done. Starr Gail Hurdy was born on Monday, February 15, 1960, to parents Billy and Hazel in Kansas City, Kansas. She was the 4th-born child into the family, having 3 older brothers at the time she arrived. Over the next few years, Billy and Hazel would round out the family with the arrival of 3 more daughters, making Starr the middle child of 7 siblings. Starr and her brothers and sisters were raised in the greater Kansas City area, where they spent a lot of time together, whether it was helping around the house or out playing with friends. At the time, Starr's father, Billy, was working as a mechanic in a shop opened by his father years earlier, a shop he would later inherit. Family and friends have described Starr as a truly kind-hearted soul who went above and beyond for those she loved. She was always the type willing to do anything for someone in need, and one characteristic her family frequently remarks upon is her optimistic disposition. It's been said that Starr was the type to smile regardless of the situation. When times were tough, she troopered through, making others smile along the way, and where things were good, she shared her joy with everyone around her. From a young age, Starr had a love for the outdoors, enjoying open fields and forests with flowers holding a special place in her heart, one that she would return to throughout her life. She performed well in school throughout her early years, but her interests were always somewhat divided. When she moved on to Turner High School, where most of her siblings would attend, her focus on education seemed to be waning. Set to graduate in 1978 when she turned 18, Starr would ultimately drop out of school before earning her diploma. While at the time Starr believed she was making the right choice, she'd revisit that choice years later. Not a lot has been shared about Starr's life after high school, though there are several details that have been released. We know that Starr would eventually marry, taking on her husband's last name of Boomer. While the marriage may have functioned well throughout its early years, it wasn't made to last. In July of 1993, when Starr was 33 years old, her life was forever changed when she gave birth to her first and only child. According to her family, Starr viewed her son as the center of her universe, and she dreamed of owning a farm where she could watch him fall in love with nature just as she had. Throughout her life, Starr had shown a special talent for growing flowers as well as arranging them. According to her sister Cynthia, she often created beautiful arrangements and wreaths, winning several awards through local craft shows. Whether it was her perpetual love of flowers, the birth of her son, or some other inspiration, Starr began thinking about education again. The young mother decided to start studying for her GED, and afterward she hoped to launch her own florist business, which she'd named Starlight. Unfortunately, things hadn't worked out as Starr had planned, and by early 1999, the 39-year-old was making plans for a reset. Sending her son to live with her parents, she began the process of packing up her own belongings. In the midst of a divorce, she planned to move into the family's home in Spring Hill until she could get back on her feet, raising her son with the assistance of her parents while she prepped for the GED test. Over the weekend of February 20th and 21st, Starr began moving things into the Hale Street home. Unfortunately, before she could complete that move or sit down to take the test she'd studied so hard for, the 39-year-old mother would vanish. Strangely, however, Starr wouldn't disappear from an empty road or a quiet apartment. Her last moments were witnessed by more than a dozen people, the vast majority of which have chosen to remain silent about what they saw that day over the more than 2 decades that have passed. In February of 1999, Starr was living in Kansas City where she shared an apartment with her friend Carolyn Marshall. The two got along well and were living in a home in the Turner area of southwest Kansas City, not far from where Starr had grown up. On the afternoon of Tuesday, February 23rd, Starr and Carolyn were running errands together when they decided to drop in on a neighborhood bar. Uncle Mike's, as it was known at the time, was located at 4901 Metropolitan Avenue on the corner of South 49th Street. A small dive bar, Uncle Mike's wasn't one of the hot spots in town that drew in younger crowds looking to party, but instead was mostly visited by groups of locals who had been dropping in for years. If you'd like to view Uncle Mike's bar, you can see it in the Vodacast app. The link is in the show notes. Kansas City has been described by many as a large city broken up into small clusters that feel like their own neighborhoods. In a spot like Uncle Mike's, many of the residents knew one another, at least by sight, and it wasn't often that new faces showed up. Star was familiar with the location, and while she surely wasn't a regular, she knew several people who were, and she felt comfortable and safe there. In an interview with the Kansas City Star, Carolyn stated that she and Star arrived at the bar in the early afternoon hours and found it rather busy. Carolyn explained that upon entering, the two women approached the small L-shaped bar, but most of the stools were occupied. Approximately 10 people were sitting at the bar, resulting in Star and Carolyn taking different seats with 4 patrons between them. According to Carolyn, she wasn't planning on spending a lot of time at the bar as she still had errands to run. She explained that she planned to have just one drink, and after finishing it, Star would be staying behind, with Carolyn planning to pick her up later. Sitting at the bar, slowly nursing her drink, Carolyn heard a loud commotion and turned to see what was going on. Reportedly, one of the men in the bar had gotten into an argument with a female, possibly his girlfriend, and the argument was taking a violent turn. While everyone else continued their drinks and private conversations, ignoring the altercation, Star climbed off her stool and stepped between the man and woman, telling the guy to back off and leave her alone. It doesn't appear that Star knew the man nor the woman, but she wasn't going to stand for someone being treated that way around her. Witnesses would later report that the man appeared to have been angry about Star's interference, but he didn't say or do anything at the time. Minutes later, however, one of the man's friends seemed to become angry about Star's behavior. Rising from his seat, he began walking towards the restroom when, all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. Carolyn explained, quote, "All of a sudden I see Star on the floor. He just jerked her off the bar stool. I don't think they even said anything to one another." End quote. According to Carolyn, after attacking Star, the man was quickly hustled out of the bar, exiting via the back door. Star got to her feet and brushed herself off, assuring Carolyn that she was all right. During the assault, Star's arm had reportedly been injured, and one of the men at the bar, Sean Pernis, was working as a paramedic. In an interview with KCTV CBS 5, Pernis explained that he'd been a regular at the location and was there when the attack happened, saying, quote, "I had been down there, I would drink beer down there, and I would see her from time to time, but we never really engaged in any conversation or anything. I went down there to have some beers, and she got into an altercation with another individual, and he slugged her. She fell off the bar stool. She was right next to me when it happened." End quote. According to Pernis, he ran down to his house, which was close to the bar, and grabbed his medical kit, bringing it back so he could treat Star's injuries. Carolyn, who had been planning on leaving, checked in with Star to make sure she was all right, and the 39-year-old told her she was fine and not to worry. According to Carolyn, she spoke to the bar owner and asked that he keep an eye on Star for her, telling him she'd be back later. Carolyn said that she asked Star if she was sure she wanted to stay or if she wanted to come with her, but Star assured her friend she was fine and would see her in a few hours. Walking out of the bar, Carolyn had no idea that this would be the last time she'd see her friend alive, and what exactly occurred over the next few hours has been a source of rumor and speculation for more than 20 years. Hours after leaving, Carolyn began looking for her friend. In some reports, it's been said that she called the bar asking for Star, at which time she was told the 39-year-old had left. In other reports, Carolyn says that she went down to the bar later that afternoon, but when she walked in, she couldn't find Star. When she asked the bartender where her friend had gone, she was reportedly told that Star had left in the company of 2 men. At the time, Carolyn was apparently unconcerned and figured that Star would call or show up back at their place later, but she never did. Since Star was in the process of moving in with their parents, Carolyn was supposedly under the impression that she may have been staying there, and as such, she wasn't very concerned for the first few days. However, when 5 days passed without seeing or speaking to Starr, on Sunday, February 28th, Carolyn reported her friend missing to the Kansas City Police Department. Upon receipt of the report, Kansas City detectives began interviewing friends and family about Starr, trying to determine whether or not the single mother may have chosen to run off, or if her disappearance might be the result of a crime. According to all of Starr's family, they were emphatic that she would never abandon her son, explaining that he meant the world to her, and if she was missing, something must have happened. Detective Max Seifert was assigned to Starr's case at the beginning, and after speaking with Carolyn, his next place to focus was Uncle Mike's bar, the last place she had been seen alive. According to Seifert, there were 13 people present at the bar that afternoon who witnessed what may have been the final moments of Starr's life. Investigators have stated that at the time, several witnesses relayed a disturbing story. According to them, Starr was violently attacked by two men who knocked her to the floor and continued to pummel her until she seemingly lost consciousness. At this point, the two men carried Starr out of the bar, shoving her into what's been described as a white or light-colored car before driving off. All of this occurred in front of the 13 witnesses who, according to police, didn't try to stop the assault or help Starr at all. Investigators began operating under the belief that Starr had either been beaten severely inside of the bar and was likely killed after being removed, or perhaps she had actually died before the two men dragged her out. Without her body, they couldn't yet be certain that Starr was in fact dead, but from almost the get-go, all investigators working her case believed that there was a very slim chance she could be alive still. Based upon information given by witnesses present that afternoon, detectives began focusing in on two persons of interest: William Spradlin, known around the area as Gino, and his friend Robert Horn, known as Butch. Both Spradlin and Horn have extensive rap sheets going back to the 1970s. The two men had both been in and out of jail over the previous 20 years, racking up charges for crimes such as burglary, felony theft, robbery, forgery, battery, arson, and possession of firearms by felons. Articles written years later would claim that witnesses had specifically identified Spradlin as the man who had knocked Starr off the bar stool earlier that afternoon, though what exactly witnesses told police is unclear. Reportedly, Spradlin had returned to the bar and began beating Starr after Carolyn left, along with his friend Horn, who helped him carry her outside to his waiting vehicle. Over the course of the next 8 months, investigators worked to gather all of the evidence they could tying both Spradlin and Horn to the crime, including taking detailed statements from witnesses. All of this culminated in October of 1999 when the two men were arrested and charged with second-degree murder. It seemed as though investigators knew what had happened and who had been responsible, but what should have been an easy case quickly fell to pieces. While it may have seemed that everything was going according to plan, District Attorney Nick Tomazik would later drop all charges against Spradlin and Horn in December. According to detectives in the DA's office, not one of the 13 witnesses present in the bar were willing to testify against either of the two defendants. According to DA Tomazik, without their statements and without Starr's body, they had very little evidence to tie either man to the crime. Not wanting to risk the possibility of double jeopardy should they lose, the case was dropped with the hope that witnesses might change their minds or additional evidence could be found. Tomazik explained to the Kansas City Star, quote, "We know that people saw what happened, but they won't admit it." End quote. Detective Seifert later stated that investigators believe Starr had likely been killed or severely injured in the bar that night prior to being dragged out by men witnesses allegedly identified as Spradlin and Horn. However, he believes that the witnesses are frightened of the suspects and were either directly intimidated into keeping their mouths shut, or they were intimidated based purely on the suspects' reputations. Seifert also noted his belief that some of the patrons at the bar that night were of the mind that Starr had stuck her nose in something that wasn't her business, and she had gotten what she deserved. Either way, Seifert remained optimistic that one of the witnesses would eventually be willing to speak up in front of a judge and jury, but sadly, that hasn't yet happened. With the witnesses unwilling to talk and the inability of investigators to gather any physical evidence or locate Starr's body, when the charges were dropped in December, the case began growing cold. It was one of those situations where police believed they knew what had happened and who had been responsible, but they couldn't prove it beyond the shadow of a doubt. While they'd received multiple tips, they often led to dead ends, and their search for evidence slowly began wavering as more time passed without any new leads. In the absence of his mother, Starr's son would be raised by his grandparents in Spring Hill. Her family was devastated by her loss, noting that she had always been the bright light among the siblings, the one who could make even the worst days feel better. They hoped desperately the police would find the evidence they needed to make charges stick, and beyond that, to locate Starr, so they might be able to give her a proper burial and hopefully find some closure and comfort in the process. They could never have imagined that so many years would pass without answers and that Starr's body would remain undiscovered. Frustrated, hurt, and grieving, Starr's sister Cynthia became determined to find the truth no matter the cost, and her search for answers would slowly change the entire course of her life. Over the next 2 years, many things would change, but the truth about Starr's final moments continued to be a tightly guarded secret held by the dozen patrons who refused to testify. In December of 2001, however, Governor Bill Graves hoped to get the wheels moving again. His office put up a $5,000 reward for information leading to Starr's body and the arrest of those responsible. At the time, Spradlin and Horn were still being viewed as the prime suspects. Spradlin had since left Kansas, moving south to Oklahoma, while Horn was behind bars in the county jail, facing 2 counts of aggravated indecent liberties with a child. In perhaps one of the more frustrating and insulting twists in the case, Uncle Mike's bar underwent a name change. Now called Nobody's Business, Starr's family felt the owner was poking fun at their pain and grief while also laughing about Starr's likely murder. Previously, detectives had wanted to conduct major searches through the building for forensic evidence in the time after Starr's disappearance, but they were never given permission, and without more evidence, they couldn't produce a warrant to compel the owner into complying. Starr's sister, Cynthia, would later tell KCTV News 5, quote, "I thought that was a slap in our family's face, and they were laughing at us and mocking us." End quote. According to customers, while the name had changed, the bar remained the same inside, and many of those who had been regulars previously continued to visit the bar often. While life seemed to be moving on for those connected to the case, the investigation itself became frozen. The 2 prime suspects remained on their radar, but without more evidence, there was little they could do to move things forward, and unless someone was willing to step up, there wouldn't be any arrests. As days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years, Starr's case remained open but cold. With investigators stuck, Cynthia began making moves herself. She'd go on to obtain a license as a private investigator and would be trained as a forensics technician. She investigated the case mostly on her own, tracking down leads and trying to find the truth of her sister's fate. Over the next 5 years, she worked with several psychics, including the infamous Sylvia Brown, though none of these collaborations managed to get her any closer to Starr. Cynthia also utilized cadaver dogs and searched areas around the bar, as well as beyond the borders of Kansas City, going through wooded areas and fields. A rumor had begun not long after Starr's disappearance that she'd been killed and her body dumped in a cave. Cynthia went to many caves in both Kansas and Missouri, but never managed to find a trace of her older sister. In February of 2006, 7 years since Starr disappeared, Cynthia sat down for an extended interview with the Kansas City Kansan. Starr disappeared on what was her sister Cynthia's 37th birthday, and every year when it comes around, she struggled to find reasons to celebrate. Instead, she spent her time writing letters to investigators and missing persons organizations, trying to get Starr added to different websites and publications. She's spoken with investigators many times, searching for more information about what may have happened, but few details have come out. Asked about what she believed happened that night in February of 1999, Cynthia explained, quote, "We believe she was murdered on my birthday, February 23rd, 1999, 7 years ago. There were about 13 witnesses who saw her get knocked to the ground and beaten until she was unconscious. Not one lifted a finger to help her. There are people who know what happened." End quote. Cynthia stated that during her own investigation, she learned new details that had not been previously revealed. Firstly, investigators had wanted to conduct a forensic sweep of the truck belonging to one of the suspects, but they were never able to. It's unclear if this was due to the vehicle being destroyed or if they couldn't get a warrant without further evidence. Beyond this, Cynthia revealed that William Gino Spradlin had been dating a female bartender at Uncle Mike's when the crime occurred. This woman's car disappeared and was later found torched, leaving little behind but the frame. Cynthia found this highly suspicious, speculating, quote, "I can only wonder if they burned it to destroy evidence, or maybe it was an attempt to intimidate her. He married her, and she could not testify against him." End quote. This was confirmed through public records which show the two as living at the same Oklahoma address, though since the woman's name has never been stated publicly, I won't name her during this episode either. Cynthia went on to explain that she had spent years saving up the money to hold a funeral for Starr, as well as the cost of having a tombstone inscribed. According to her, the family wasn't willing to hold a funeral until her body was located, but she wanted to make sure everything would be in place when that day came to pass. She went on to discuss a funeral, as well as how she had devoted most of her life to finding Starr, saying, quote, "The whole thing is horrifying. I still pursue it. I go to the media as much as I can. It has affected us a lot. Starr's boy is 10 years old now, and he does pretty well, but our family wants to know where Starr is. We'd like to have a funeral for her. I will continue to pursue this until my family finds justice and closure. She was a human being and does not deserve to be thrown away like trash. I can't sleep, and it's hard for me to hold an 8 to 5 job. I have to have flexible time to continue to be devoted to this. I can't give up. I don't mean for this to be an obsession, but I want justice for her." End quote. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation created a page focusing on Starr's case, listing the details of her disappearance and making reference to the suspects without giving their names. Instead, one of the men is described by the KBI as a man believed to be a lifelong criminal with a history of violent behavior, particularly towards women. Captain Mike Kobe told reporters that the case remained open and that leads were still being pursued, though he urged the public to come forward with whatever information they may have, as without them, they may never be able to close the file. Cynthia went on to discuss Starr's son, who struggled to understand her disappearance for many years. She explained, quote, "He's starting to open up a little bit. I remember once being on a field trip with him, and he started pointing at a cemetery crying, 'Is my mommy in that grave? Where's she at?'" End quote. By 2006, enough time had passed for them to be able to officially have Starr declared dead, another difficult task needing to be executed. Cynthia explained, quote, "We've had to wait 7 years just to reach that point. Now we have to go to court and fight that. I just hope somebody comes forward. If it had happened to somebody in their family, they would want a proper burial and funeral for them, and that little boy deserves some answers, and so do my mother and father." End quote. Unfortunately, 3 more years would pass with little development in Starr's investigation. Then, in January of 2009, the disappearance of a Kansas City, Missouri woman would lead investigators on a complicated ride involving one of the last people to ever see Starr alive. On Friday, January 2nd, a 35-year-old nurse's instructor and mother of 3 was last seen at her home across the state line in Kansas City, Missouri, just 16 miles northeast of Uncle Mike's bar. 3 days later, the missing woman's cell phone was found discarded along Gladstone Boulevard, approximately 12 miles southeast of her home in an area she was never known to frequent. The missing woman's husband of 10 years told investigators that he was asleep in the house during the time that his wife disappeared, and he didn't remember anything out of the ordinary. The couple had a troubled marriage, with the missing woman filing for divorce 4 years earlier in 2005, though she later withdrew that filing. The husband, a soldier in the army, was sent to Iraq and returned to the States where he was to join the National Guard. However, in the weeks leading up to his scheduled training, the marriage hit the rocks again. With divorce looming, he was supposed to move out of the family home following his training. However, his wife vanished the very day he was supposed to leave for that training. On January 10th, 8 days after the disappearance, police searched the family home and noted several disturbing discoveries. While the house itself was messy, the garage was exceedingly clean, and it was determined that the floor had been acid etched and recently mopped. Guns, ammunition, and apparent blood evidence were removed from the home, and when questioned, the woman's husband stated he had last seen her on January 1st, or maybe January 2nd, seemingly struggling to keep his story straight. In the days following his wife's disappearance, the man had been seen kissing another woman, and he had created online dating profiles listing himself as single. Investigators found witnesses who connected a white truck to the area where the missing woman's phone had been found, and this in turn connected to a woman named Kelly Sharp. As it turned out, the missing woman's husband admitted to having an affair with Sharp, which had begun in late December of 2008, just weeks before his wife disappeared. Detectives were zeroing in on the husband when they made another suspicious discovery. While he had worked as a volunteer firefighter in Independence, Missouri, he'd been assigned to Station 7. However, early in the morning of Saturday, January 3rd, the day after his wife went missing, the husband's electronic keycard had been used to gain entry to Station 5. This was the hazardous waste materials station, which contained various cleaning supplies and solvents. While the investigation had taken more than a year, in May of 2010, police arrested and charged 37-year-old Sean Andrew Pernis with the murder of his wife, Renee Michelle Pretz Pernis. Sean Pernis was president Uncle Mike's bar the night Star disappeared, and later admitted to treating her injured arm following the first assault she'd been the victim of. With Pernis being charged with the murder of his own wife, investigators back in Kansas began to consider the possibility that he may have played a role in Star's disappearance as well. According to her family, witnesses at the bar that afternoon claimed that Sean had either injected Star with something or had put something in her drink during the time where he was supposedly patching up her wounds. Over the course of the next 2 years, Pernis denied any involvement in his wife's disappearance, and when speaking to investigators about Star, he stated that while he had been in the bar that afternoon, he was not involved in whatever had happened to her. 2 more years passed when in February of 2012 his story changed, at least when it came to his wife. In an emergency session called on Tuesday, February 21st, Sean Pernis took a deal, pleading guilty to involuntary manslaughter in Renee's death. Pernis stated that he and Renee had gotten into a screaming argument that turned violent, leading him to strike her. Pernis testified that after hitting Renee, she had fallen backwards down the stairs, and when he rushed to check on her, she was dead. He says he then disposed of his wife's body in a dumpster and began the process of cleaning up the crime scene. Pernis was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in prison, and Renee's body has never been found. He would later tell KCTV News 5, quote, "I pled guilty to manslaughter. I received 15 years from the state, from the judge. That's punitive measures there. I owe the families, my children, the community, and God more restitution for what I've done." End quote. While the arrest and conviction of Sean Pernis led many to believe that he might finally reveal all that he knew about Star's disappearance, perhaps even his own involvement, he remained quiet, only admitting to having been at the bar and to giving medical attention to Star. Any hope for a revelation was overshadowed by Pernis's silence as, once again, the investigation began growing cold. There wouldn't be a new development for 7 more years, when in March of 2019, 20 years since Star was last seen alive, A new tip would deliver investigators a lead on a yet unidentified man who may have knowledge about the crime. The tipster would also take police to a familiar vacant lot where he believed Starr's remains were buried. Kansas City Detective William Carpenter and Master Detective Tiffany Bergdorf were now in charge of investigating the disappearance, which had been reopened 2 years earlier in 2017. Speaking to KCTV News 5, Carpenter expressed how frustrating the investigation was, especially considering what they knew. He explained, quote, "When you believe you know who did it, it's very frustrating. When you have their names and you look at their pictures and you know who they are and you know what they did. We know the story. We know what happened to her and we know who did it. We just need a little more information to be able to put it together and get these guys charged. There are people out there that can help us do that." End quote. According to the detectives, upon reopening the case, they'd been able to make several new advances. The bar, formerly known as Uncle Mike's and then Nobody's Business, had come under new ownership. The new owner was much more cooperative and allowed detectives to rip up wooden planks and tiles of the floor in search of forensic evidence. While they hoped to find traces of blood, which they could connect to Starr, it's unclear if they did or not. To date, they haven't revealed what, if anything, they located in the bar, but for them, it was more about the process, checking everything to make sure they were doing all they could to find the truth. Through the course of their new investigation, they were also given the name of a man that they desperately wished to speak with. According to Detective Carpenter, a man named Edward was present in the bar the afternoon Starr vanished, and he has information about what happened and who was responsible. Unfortunately, little is known about him, including his last name. All detectives could say was that in February of '99, Edward frequented the Turner neighborhood and was a regular in Uncle Mike's. He may have been employed as a mechanic at the time, but he's since moved away and they haven't been able to track him down. Carpenter went on saying, quote, "We believe that Edward has a lot of information, and Edward, by what we were told, was not directly involved in this, but may have a lot of information, and he could be very helpful to talk to." End quote. The detectives went on to say that the witness who mentioned Edward also told them that he knew where Starr's body had been buried, and he led them to that location. It wasn't a new spot for investigators who had been suspicious of it for years. Back in 1999, a home once stood in that spot, and it had a direct connection to Starr. She'd been having an on-again, off-again relationship with the man who lived there. This property is also located less than half a mile from the bar, just 2 blocks south along 49th Street. In the years that had passed, the man had moved away and the home was ultimately torn down and buried beneath what is today an overgrown lot. Detectives were eager to see what they could find. However, with it being early in the year, they were planning to wait for the spring thaw, when the ground would soften up, before they brought in cadaver dogs to go through the lot. The detectives also made a plea to the public, and most specifically to those 13 people who had been in the bar the day Starr vanished. They wanted to make it clear that after 20 years, if they had information, they needed to come forward now. They no longer had to worry about a violent reprisal from any potential suspect, including Spradlin and Horn, with Master Detective Bergdorf saying, quote, "There was a genuine fear when this all happened. Everybody was younger, so they probably had a genuine fear of these people, and there's no reason to fear them now. They're old men." End quote. 5 months later, in August of 2019, investigators arrived at the vacant lot where the home of Starr's former boyfriend used to stand. Joining police was a geological team from the University of Kansas who brought along ground-penetrating radar. At the time, detectives didn't have large machinery or special tools for their search and instead were armed only with shovels and hand trowels. For just over 8 hours, several investigators were down on their hands and knees digging through the earth in search of any evidence. However, they would run into a difficult barrier. As it turned out, when the house that formerly stood on the lot was demolished, the construction crew had backfilled the property. What this meant was, after tearing down the house and removing large pieces for disposal, The basement of the home was filled in with pieces of the house, chunks of concrete and limestone, and much of the soil which had been disturbed. Based on the information they'd been given by their tipster, investigators were interested in two specific locations: the site of the former driveway and the basement floor. However, much of that was now several feet beneath the earth. When digging ended that day, it was clear they would need more than hand tools to find what they were looking for. As a result, detectives didn't want to return to the site the next day, instead making arrangements to return at a later date with more diggers, better equipment, and cadaver dogs. Movement on the case made Starr's family feel like they were once again given a reason to hope that the answers were coming. While we don't know exactly what investigators told the Hurdy family about the dig and the tip they'd received, it appeared they all began to believe Starr would be found beneath that vacant lot. Asked about her daughter's disappearance, Starr's mother Hazel told KCTV News 5, quote, "I just started praying and crying, thinking, I don't know what's going on, but I know something's wrong. She's not here. It's still hard, you never get over it, but as it goes on, you just keep thinking, are her remains ever going to be found?" End quote. Tragically, while it seemed possible that for the first time in 2 decades they might be on the verge of breaking the case, one member of Starr's family wouldn't live to see the results. On Wednesday, October 23rd, Cynthia K. Hurdy passed away. Cynthia, who had dedicated the previous 20 years of her life to the search for justice and her sister's remains, had been battling cancer for several years. In the midst of a renewed investigation into the case, Cynthia was admitted to the Olathe Medical Center, where she succumbed to the illness. Sitting down for one of her last interviews 7 months earlier in March, Cynthia was on oxygen as she lamented how long and difficult the disappearance of her sister had been. She explained, quote, "All the things that we had to go through with detectives and KBI and the police department and cadaver dogs and private investigators and all of that. It's been a long, hard ride. They need to pay for it. They don't need to be out on the streets hurting and doing other things to other people. I think eventually, in the end, God's got their number, and they're going to have to pay for it one way or another." End quote. To her last breath, Cynthia fought for the truth, to deliver justice, to see Starr's remains recovered, the love of a sister refusing to be suppressed. Hopefully, she might now rest in peace knowing Starr's case hasn't been forgotten, and where she's left off, others will continue. 1 month later, on Saturday, November 30th, the family held a memorial for Cynthia. Whether it was mere coincidence or the curiousness of fate, it was during this service that detectives reached out and notified the family that they would be conducting a multiple-day excavation at the vacant lot beginning on Monday, December 2nd. Unfortunately, they'd be working with a disadvantage. Blueprints of the home had been lost over the years, so detectives had no way of knowing how the home had been oriented or where exactly they might find the foundation. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in and scanned over the entire lot. In one particular location, radar showed something approximately 3 to 4 feet beneath the surface. Near that same spot, cadaver dogs indicated that they too detected something beneath the earth. Detective Carpenter explained to Fox 4 News, quote, "It doesn't necessarily mean there's a body there, but there's more than likely than not something the dog was interested in, which may be of a similar scent to bones or something of that nature." End quote. On Tuesday, December 3rd, investigators returned to the scene, this time with heavy machinery in tow. The entire plot was plotted out on a grid where anomalies may be, using different colored string to mark spots that might have something beneath them. They managed to locate the site of the former driveway, and after pulling up several feet of earth and sifting through the soil, they were able to determine that nothing was buried there. Detectives noted that, among debris from the former house, they'd found a tremendous amount of sand beneath the soil, which wasn't typical to this location, and reportedly, sand had not been used during the backfilling. Next, their attention turned to the foundation where the tipster had suggested that Starr might be buried beneath the floor. KCTV News 5 reporter Angie Riccono had previously run several stories about Starr's case, and before contacting police, the tipster had reached out to her. Riccono explained, quote, "About 8 months ago, someone contacted me and said you can find Star Boomer's body about 2 blocks from that bar where she vanished. Star's body was under a thin layer of concrete 2 blocks south of the bar on the east side of the street, and that's where police are digging now. Many of the homes in this area have limestone basements, so when Star died, the men reportedly dug a hole in the basement and just patched concrete over top. Anyone who went down in the basement could see a limestone floor and a patch of concrete." End quote. On Wednesday, December 4th, investigators announced they'd gone through approximately 1/4 of the property and dug up about half of the key area they were focused on. Among other materials discovered, several pieces of cloth were found, though at the time detectives were unsure whether or not they had any connection to Star. Determined to find everything possible, the excavation continued with Master Detective Bergdorf telling reporters, quote, "We're not going to leave any stone unturned. We're here. We need to verify we have done everything in our power to follow up on every lead that we have gotten." End quote. The next day, Thursday, December 5th, investigators announced they'd finally reached the basement level and they were using ground-penetrating radar once again to try and zero in on different spots, feeling that the radar would be more accurate being run directly against the concrete rather than several feet of soil above where it had previously scanned. Once the scans were complete, they began removing pieces of concrete and limestone from the basement floor, which, to their surprise, had been found intact. Detectives told reporters that since they had begun the dig, they'd received several new tips and were developing leads. They once again implored anyone with information to come forward because if they didn't find anything beneath that house, they would need to turn the case in a different direction. One man who was of the belief that they wouldn't find anything was a local named Billy Davenport. Davenport, a cousin to one of the men who had been previously charged with Starr's murder, didn't think anything connected to Starr would be found beneath the basement floor. Davenport stated that he was present in Uncle Mike's on the day that Starr disappeared, telling reporters that he had witnessed the assault on the 39-year-old. He explained, quote, "The first thing that hit the floor was her head, and we all jumped up, but there wasn't anything we could do, really. I just knew I needed to get the hell out of there, that's what I knew. They carried her out through the back door. I thought they would do the right thing and get some help. That's what I thought." End quote. Davenport went on to explain that the entire dig operation was a waste of taxpayer money, telling the media that Starr wasn't going to be found there. Instead, he stated his belief that the old rumor was true, and Starr was buried somewhere in a cave outside of Kansas City in an isolated location where she was unlikely to ever be found. Unfortunately, Davenport would be proven right, at least partially, when the next day, Friday, December 6th, investigators held a press conference to announce that they had not found anything beneath the former home's basement. While this was obviously a setback for them, detectives stated that not finding anything at least helped them rule out another location that had not previously been searched to such a thorough degree. Detective Carpenter made it clear that this wasn't the end, explaining that his life's goal was to find Starr and bring her killers to justice. Carpenter stated, quote, "If I don't ever do anything else, if I can arrest the people responsible for her murder, that would make my career worthwhile." End quote. In the aftermath of the dig, detectives answered many questions from the media. A large percentage of those questions focused in on Sean Burness, who was 7 years into his 15-year sentence for the murder of his wife, Renee. Investigators noted that they had spoken to Burness on several occasions about Starr's disappearance, and it was their belief that he wasn't a suspect, but instead was a witness to what had happened. Seeking answers directly from Burness, KCTV was able to arrange an interview with the man. Pointing out that he was at the bar and lived in a home nearby on the day Starr went missing, Burness was asked about his thoughts about being investigated as a potential suspect in the case when he was first arrested for the murder of his wife. Burness replied, quote, "At that time, I was angry about it. But given to what I was then being investigated for, it was what you do as an investigator. You look at all the pieces, and yeah, that happened in the past, so of course they're going to link me to it. End quote. Asked about that day, when Starr vanished, Pernis expressed his hope that the case would be solved, revealing new details about the two men who had been previously charged with her murder. He stated, quote, "I want closure for that family that are suffering from a missing person because I dealt with the same issue, being a perpetrator, and I did that to a family. So I would want their family to have closure too. I always wondered, where they buried her or where they put her. We had some ideas because the individuals that allegedly did this, I remember, that they came back to the bar, and they were covered in dust from a rock quarry, is what we originally thought." End quote. According to Pernis, after Starr was dragged out of the bar by the two men believed to be Spradlin and Horn, they returned sometime later covered in dust which looked as though it might be from a quarry. Many, however, have been left to wonder if perhaps the dust wasn't from a quarry, but instead from that rumored cave where Starr's body was allegedly disposed of. If you're listening in the Vodacast app, you can listen to the full interview with Sean Pernis. The link is in the show notes. With the lack of answers found beneath the old house's foundation, it was becoming more and more likely that Starr's body was somewhere away from the bar, perhaps even outside of Kansas City where, without further information, there were too many possibilities to even know where to begin. Unfortunately, all hope that Starr would be found and her case broken open began to fade as the calendar moved from 2019 to 2020, and detectives were seemingly back to the drawing board. This past June, protesters gathered outside the office of the Kansas City Police Department, calling attention to the nearly 400 unsolved homicides in the county since 1967. Many people signed petitions calling on the department to create a cold case unit to investigate these cases, among which is the disappearance of Starr Boomer. The timing of these protests coincided with the swearing in of the city's new chief of police, Carl Oakman. According to Chief Oakman, he agrees about the need for a dedicated cold case unit, and according to the department, they have plans on launching one next month in January of 2022. It remains to be seen what exactly happens with the potential new unit, but the hope remains that all of the unsolved cases in the city and surrounding areas will finally get the benefit of new investigations and fresh eyes. Unfortunately, though, this is where Starr's investigation comes to a standstill. While her case remains open and new leads have been pursued since 2019, there have been no further developments, and we're now approaching the 22nd straight year without answers, without arrests, and without the recovery of Starr's remains. Some of the witnesses present at the bar that afternoon in February of 1999 are still alive and continue to maintain their silence. After more than 2 decades, it seems, the weight of being a snitch or handing over information that could lead to the arrest of violent and dangerous criminals continues to keep mouths shut and eyes focused dead ahead. You can't help but wonder sometimes, what exactly is the underlying difference between a cold and vicious killer and the people who have the ability to tell the truth, to solve the case, but simply choose not to? Starr Gail Hurdy Boomer was last seen alive on Tuesday, February 23rd at Uncle Mike's Bar, 4901 Metropolitan Avenue in southwest Kansas City, Kansas. When last seen, Starr has been described as being a white female with blonde or light brown hair and blue eyes, standing 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing approximately 140 pounds. She has a rose tattoo on her chest, a bear on her outer ankle, and a partial barbed wire tattoo elsewhere. Starr was last seen wearing blue jeans, a blue jean jacket, and athletic shoes. She was known to be carrying a purse which contained $80 in cash. It has never been recovered. At the time of her disappearance, Starr was 39 years old, and if alive today, she'd be turning 62 this coming February. This sister, daughter, aunt, and mother was brutally and violently assaulted that afternoon before her attacker and his friend came back to finish the job, dragging Starr outside in view of at least 13 witnesses. 2 of those witnesses have come forward in the past 22 years, providing investigators with tips, but those who could identify the suspects and give further details have chosen to remain silent. Investigators are also interested in locating and speaking with a man known only as Edward. He was present in the bar that afternoon and was known to be a regular. He frequented the Turner neighborhood of Kansas City in 1999 and may have been working as a mechanic. In the years since, he's moved away, and police have been unable to track him without his last name or additional distinguishing details. If you are Edward, or you know Edward, you may be able to finally provide the closure and justice Cynthia went to her grave seeking, and the remaining members of Starr's family continue to hope for. When someone vanishes from a dark country road or an isolated location with no witnesses, no physical evidence, and no apparent motives, cracking that case is incredibly difficult. Not knowing where to begin, not knowing who may be responsible, there are so many different possibilities, and the absence of evidence can make it nearly impossible. But that didn't happen here. Starr Boomer was beaten and dragged from a public location in view of multiple witnesses. They saw the men and wouldn't name them. They saw the assault but wouldn't lift a finger to help. All these years later, somehow, they continue to live their lives knowing they could assuage the grief of a family and take killers off the street. Instead, they keep their silence, never imagining that one day it could be their own child, spouse, or friend that becomes a victim. Apparently, even 22 years is not long enough to grow a conscience. Hazel Hurdy has lived through many hardships and experienced many painful losses over her 87 years. Her husband Billy passed away in 2008 at the age of 78, never knowing what became of his daughter. Hazel has lost 2 sons, Billy and Larry, and 2 daughters, Cynthia and Starr. From a family of 9, only 4 remain. Asked about the case, her missing daughter, and more than 2 decades without answers, Hazel Hurdy draws power from faith and her belief that the truth can't remain hidden forever. She explains, quote, "I believe that we will find her. I really believe that. I've never given up hope. God's going to give us peace, finally, that we can rest with that, and we're going to go on with our lives like she would want us to. She would want us to be happy." 22 years ago, Starr Boomer walked into Uncle Mike's bar and was never seen alive again. In the wake of her disappearance, a family was left to try and put the pieces together while raising Starr's young son, who never got to know his mother nor how much she loved him. Her younger sister Cynthia dedicated the last 20 years of her life to trying to deliver justice and to find her body so that she might be buried beside her family. Sadly, Cynthia went to an early grave, never finding the answers she so desperately sought, and to this day, Starr's body has never been recovered, nor her killers brought to trial. So many unsolved missing persons cases are complicated by an absence of evidence, witnesses, clues, and possibilities. How many times on Trace Evidence have we explored a case where no one can be sure what happened, and there are countless theories about potential motives and suspects? Far more than I've ever kept track of, and each one is as frustrating as the next. For a long time, I believed those cases were truly the most heartbreaking, but that was before I began researching the disappearance of Starr Boomer. Maybe you're not the bar-going type. It's just not your scene. That's fine. I'm not crazy about them myself. But for many people, they enjoy being able to sit down, have a drink or two, and socialize with folks they don't know well or at all. Every town has its hot spots, the brightly lit bars with random themes designed to draw you in and keep you feeding money over the bar while you're mystified by random decorations all over the walls. Then, on the side streets, where tourists don't tend to explore, you've got your local dives. Maybe not the best looking places, but there's personality and atmosphere that keeps locals coming back time and again. It becomes their place, where they can escape their worries for a little while and have a good time. That's what Uncle Mike's was to its regulars, their own little hangout, and even the murder of a woman wasn't enough to get them off their stools. 13 people stood by, silently watching or passively trying to ignore the horrifying scene unfolding before them. Two large, rough, and violent men mercilessly assaulting a petite woman who had no ability to defend herself under those circumstances. They said nothing when she was knocked to the floor. They did nothing when fists and boots rained down on her. They kept silent as she was carried out unconscious or maybe even dead. I know the men who committed this heinous crime are monsters. Anyone who would do something like this can hardly qualify as human. But what can you say about those who stood by and ignored it and allowed it to happen? The ones who had a chance to tell the truth but chose not to. The ones who, even more than 20 years later, haven't found the courage, heart, or decency to speak up. Starr was killed by monsters, but they've been permitted to continue on with their lives, hurting others along the way, because this group of people have allowed them to. They don't merely have Starr's blood on their hands, but the blood of everyone who has suffered at the hands of these violent criminals. Honestly, let's move on from this because the more I think about it, the more it really pisses me off. There haven't exactly been a lot of different theories about Starr. Investigators believe they know what happened and who was responsible, but there are some angles that have raised differing possibilities over the years. Detectives and the DA's office focused in on William Gino Spradlin and Robert Butch Horn. Others believe that it goes beyond coincidence to accept that Sean Pernice, later convicted of involuntary manslaughter in the death of his wife, wasn't somehow involved. So let's begin by looking at Pernice before moving on to Spradlin and Horn. Sean Andrew Pernice was 26 years old when he sat on a bar stool at Uncle Mike's and witnessed the first assault against Starr. He'd later join the Army, but back in '99 he was working as a medic for a Missouri fire department. According to his statements, he saw a man punch Starr, knocking her off the stool to the floor. The man quickly left, but Starr had injured her arm, so Pernice rushed to his house to get a first aid kit. At the time, he had a home located south of the bar on 49th Street, just a tenth of a mile past the site police excavated in 2019. All in all, the round-trip drive would have taken less than 3 minutes to complete. Pernice claims that upon returning to the bar, he dressed Starr's injuries and that was the end of it. However, we know that sometime after he treated her, Starr was violently attacked and dragged out of the bar, allegedly by the two suspects who were charged with her murder in October of '99, before those charges were dropped 2 months later. Researching Pernice, though, becomes a study of two very different personalities. On the one hand, there's a young man who trains as a medic and wants to help others, enlisting in the army and serving in Iraq. On the other, there's a violent killer who murdered his own wife during a fit of rage and went to great lengths to cover it up, so much so that Renee's body has never been found. Former soldiers who claim to have served with Pernice describe a man more in line with the latter. On a posting about Starr's case, several former military members chimed in giving their account of Pernice, describing him as a manipulative womanizer who talked negatively about his wife and spent a lot of his free time trying to bed other female soldiers. He was described as having a sense of superiority, that he was better than other medics, and at least one poster claimed that Pernice had gone out of his way to run a female medic out of the unit after she'd resisted his advances. Obviously, there's no way of knowing for certain how true any of that might be, but it doesn't exactly come across as surprising, does it? Pernice speaks in interviews about how he needs to make penance for what he's done, directly acknowledging that he was the perpetrator who stole a woman from her family and then spent years lying about it and trying to cover his tracks. To say he possesses the ability to commit murder is obviously an understatement, but the rumors of his involvement in Starr's disappearance are fairly weak, to say the least. A few unnamed sources claim that Pernice either injected Starr with something or put something in her drink that afternoon, but police have never confirmed this, nor even commented on it. In fact, when asked about Pernice, they've referred to him as a witness, specifically saying he is not a suspect in the crime. While many people struggle to believe a killer like Pernice could have been there that day and not be involved, I think from just looking at the other suspects it becomes clear that Uncle Mike drew in a dangerous crowd. While I have no care or compassion for a man who would kill his wife, the mother of his children, and then go to great extents to cover it up, including disposing of her remains, I struggle to see where he would have been involved in Starr's disappearance. Let's face it, according to detectives, witness accounts gave the district attorney's office enough to feel that charging Spradlin and Horn was a safe bet, until, of course, all of those witnesses refused to testify. Back in '99, Furness didn't have a reputation as a violent guy, a tough guy, or anything that would make people fear him. While it's difficult to know what exactly these witnesses were willing to say, it seems a bit hard to believe that no one would have given Perniss's name or description to investigators were he involved. Beyond that, when he was arrested for his wife's murder, you'd think one of these witnesses would have popped up and connected him to Starr's disappearance as well, but that never happened. Perniss is not a good man, but instead a violent killer who put his own desires above the life of his wife. He was willing to kill her and cover it up to continue living the life he wanted, and when that became threatened, he became violent. However, he wasn't a serial killer or someone who'd been connected to any other homicides. He wasn't running around killing people or attacking women out in the open. While obviously there's some major psychological issues there, it doesn't seem like there's ever been anything to directly link him to Starr's case beyond the fact that he was there that day and lived nearby. I mean, if investigators thought he was involved, I think they'd make it clear that they'd go to any lengths to try and find evidence to confirm it. They never did, though, because apparently everyone in the bar told a similar story to Perniss's, that Starr was attacked by the two men believed to be William Spradlin and Robert Horn. So let's move on to them. Looking into Spradlin and Horn's criminal history, you'll find an overlap of a lot of different crimes, some violent, some not. There's arrests for theft, forgery, robbery, escape from custody, arson, burglary, illegal possession of firearms, aggravated battery, and a whole series of arrests related to substance abuse, with driving with suspended licenses, public intoxication, and driving under the influence. Records go back to the 70s when the men would have been in their early to mid-20s. To say they've been career criminals wouldn't really be an exaggeration, and even the KBI described one of them as a man believed to be a lifelong criminal with a history of violent behavior, particularly towards women. Sounds as though, at least in this case, the shoe fits. Around the time of Starr's disappearance, Spradlin is associated with an address on Gibbs Road, 2 miles southeast of the bar, while Horn had an address less than 5 miles north of Uncle Mike's, as well as one less than 1/10 of a mile south of it. Strangely, if you lay out the addresses in February of '99, what you'd find is that Spradlin, Horn, and Perniss all had homes or apartments within 6 miles of that bar. In fact, one of Horn's former homes is located on South 49th, 1/10 of a mile north of the vacant lot where investigators were digging, making it just 2/10 of a mile north of where Sean Perniss was living. It's somewhat curious that investigators went to such lengths to search the vacant lot, digging up the foundation of the old house, but there don't appear to have been any searches in any of the homes formerly belonging to Spradlin, Horn, or Perniss. It's a little strange, isn't it? That Perniss lived 1/10 of a mile south of the house where they were digging, and Horn had stayed 1/10 of a mile north of where they were digging. Maybe that's just me, maybe it's coincidence, but I find it hard to believe in coincidence after a certain amount of time. According to Perniss, when the two men returned to the bar that afternoon, they were covered in dust. He assumed they'd been to a quarry as the dust looked like it had come from rocks. If indeed many of the homes along South 49th had limestone basements, it seems entirely possible that the tipster who led police to the lot could have been mistaken. Maybe he meant to lead them to the house 1/10 of a mile north where Horn lived, or the one where Perniss had lived 1/10 of a mile south. Both locations had been built between 1940 and 1955, around the same time the now torn down house was built, so there's a good chance they used similar materials. If true, it's surely possible that the concrete patch beneath which Starr was hidden could be in another house on the same street. For the record, I did a lot of research into the home that had been torn down, but it didn't really lead anywhere. The former owners don't have major criminal records, they haven't been charged with violent crimes, and they've never been discussed by investigators as potential suspects. So, what makes more sense to you? That if Spradlin and Horn killed Star, they'd take her to her on again, off again boyfriend's house to bury her because for some reason he wouldn't say anything, or that they might have taken her to one of their own houses. I suppose that's not something we can really know, but I do think it's worth taking a deeper look into. Also, it's somewhat curious that Star would have been in that area, staying with her boyfriend, and didn't know either Spradlin or Horn. She was on the street Horn lived on. She visited Uncle Mike's enough that Pernis said he'd seen her there before, but they'd never spoken. Yet, there's never been any connection established between Star and either of the suspects. Maybe she didn't know them well, maybe they weren't friends, but if everyone in the bar was concerned enough about their safety to not testify, it seems unlikely Star wouldn't have been aware of the men, if by nothing other than reputation. We know that Star interrupted an argument in the bar, which seems likely to have been between Spradlin and his girlfriend who worked there. The two later married. I don't know about you, but to me, it seems like the details of that argument could be valuable to trying to figure out what exactly happened here. Sure, they could just be psychos who took the opportunity to kill Star because they could. But there's also a chance something was said or done that made them angry enough to want to do it. Unfortunately, without knowing what the witnesses said, what the argument was about, what the relationship was between the woman and the man who were arguing, you could go in circles for days with all the different possibilities. I don't believe the DA's office would have brought anyone up on charges if they didn't think they had enough to nail them in the first place. Witness statements must have made it clear that Spradlin and Horn were the men who attacked Star. With those statements, they may have been able to get a conviction, or at least have gotten one to roll over on the other. But when the witnesses decided not to testify, the entire case fell apart. There's no physical evidence, Star's body's never been found, and apparently there's not enough evidence to charge them without the witnesses. So what does that tell us? Those statements had to contain details that linked to Spradlin and Horn, enough for investigators to believe they were involved, something they continue to believe to this day. They've made it clear. They know what happened, they know who did it, but they can't prove it, because not one person in that bar is willing to stand up and speak the truth. Maybe Pernis would, but if he's your only witness and he's a confirmed killer who was in the bar that day, defense attorneys would absolutely shred him on the stand, and they'd certainly be able to create enough reasonable doubt to earn a not guilty verdict. Unfortunately, police and prosecutors found themselves between a rock and a hard place where they remain today. It's clear that Spradlin and Horn are the two most likely suspects here, especially since no one else has ever been named or charged. They couldn't have gotten away with it without help, however. From the witnesses refusing to testify, to the bar owner not allowing investigators to search for evidence, to the female employee whose car was torched before she married Spradlin. I'd truly love to know if that torched car was white or light colored, like the one witnesses described Star being taken to after she was beaten in the bar. It might also be worth noting that, prior to marrying Spradlin, his girlfriend had the same last name as the owner of Uncle Mike's, and he comes up as a relative of hers during background checks. It seems likely this wasn't just a cover-up from the patrons, but from the entire bar. Unfortunately, we don't have a set timeline. We don't know when Star arrived, when she was first attacked, when Carolyn left, when she was attacked and dragged out, nor when the two men returned covered in some kind of dust. It'd be helpful to know if the men returned an hour later, 2 hours later, or more, because you could begin clocking how far they may have traveled during that time. Being that they came back the same day, I can't imagine it was very far, nor could they have spent a lot of time digging or disposing of Star's remains. The sheer fact that they walked back into that bar covered in dust after what they had just done seems to be confirmation that they didn't have any fear anyone there was going to turn them in. Sadly, they seem to have been correct. 22 years have passed, yet the case remains in the same position it's been since early on. 2 suspects, 13 witnesses, and no ability to move forward. I can't begin to imagine why someone would go out of their way to protect either of these men, whether it was due to fear, loyalty, or just not wanting to get involved. Especially after all this time. How do you go on with your life knowing the truth but choosing not to share it? Star was murdered in a vicious and violent act. But those who watched in silence and continue to protect the perpetrators all these years later are just as guilty and deserve no more compassion and consideration than you'd give to the killers themselves. It is heartbreaking, maddening, and sickening. One thing it's not, however, is it's not too late. This case could leap forward, charges could be filed, arrests made, and maybe even Starr's remains could be recovered if just one person from that night would contact investigators and tell what they saw. Stand by it, testify, do the right thing, and finally help put to rest this dark and disturbing crime that continues to haunt a family after 2 decades. They're old men now, shells of the hulking monsters they were back then. Even if you don't want to be a snitch or a traitor or whatever the hell you define it as, obviously someone out there knows where Starr's body is hidden. Just revealing that, anonymously even, could help bring some closure to the family and ease their pain. What exactly are you still afraid of? Because at this point, if it's not fear that's keeping you quiet, then maybe you are just a monster too. On a cool February afternoon in 1999, 39-year-old Starr Boomer walked into Uncle Mike's bar and didn't make it out alive. Left behind, her family struggled to come to terms with the reality that they would never see her again, though they clung to the hope that someday she'd be found and those responsible for her death would receive the justice due to them. Sadly, 22 years later, those who stole Starr away have never been held accountable, because those with the power and the knowledge to testify against them have chosen instead to stand with the killers rather than the victim. Starr stood up for a woman she believed was in trouble, and in the end it may have led to her own murder, because not one other person in that bar had even a sliver of the courage, strength, and compassion that she did. Today, her case remains open, but there haven't been any major developments since the digging in 2019. We can only hope that sometime, sooner or later, detectives will find something to break this case open. Unfortunately, without new information, the discovery of Starr's body, or one of those witnesses finally stepping up and telling what they know, the disappearance of Starr Boomer will remain open, unsolved, and growing cold. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Starr Boomer, there are many websites and forums discussing the case. In the media, the Kansas City Star and KCTV News 5 have done the most extensive coverage. If you have any information about the disappearance of Starr Boomer, please contact the Kansas City Police Department at 913-288-7248. Her agency case number is 990-23525. You can also contact the KBI at 785-296-4017, or you can submit a tip through their website at kbi.ks.gov. You can also contact Kansas City Metro Crime Stoppers at 816-474-8477, or visiting their website at kccrimestoppers.com. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. Trace Evidence would not be possible without support from amazing listeners like you. And now I'd like to take a moment to thank our fantastic Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Ann Bertram, Brittany Bivens, Christine Greco, Krista Colvin, Denise Dingsdale, Donna Buttram, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Eloanne Meyer, Eric Sumter, Guillermo Pinto, Haley Christie, James, Jen Trebb, Jennifer Winkler, Jill Sense, Joni Berkowitz, Julie Mangano, Kara Moreland, Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Marla Wright, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Orange Patches, Quinn McBreen, Roberta Jansen, Sarah Levanon, Sarah Lyons, Travis Skepko, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Adorable Susie Summers, Taylor, Tom Archer, Tom Radford, and Tracy Woods. Your contributions to Trace Evidence are invaluable, and your support of the show is both appreciated and extremely humbling. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence and gaining access to exclusive merch and ad-free episodes, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence or go to trace-evidence.com and click on the support option. I want to thank you for listening to this disturbing, frustrating, and heartbreaking episode. Hopefully someday soon, justice will arrive for Star Boomer and her family. So thank you again for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.